You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Hello and welcome, or welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. We talk a lot about the physical in this podcast, about the impacts yoga can have on our muscles, organs, and glands, our fascia, our circulatory systems, our central nervous system. But we also acknowledge that the practice goes well beyond the physical. Today, we are discussing some of its more spiritual aspects, including the often asked question, is yoga a religion? Which might not have as simple and straightforward an answer as you might think. Here to guide our conversation is returning guest Firdose Moonda. You'll remember that Firdose is a journalist, academic, and researcher, as well as a yoga teacher running her own business, Soldier Yoga. She holds an MA in the traditions of yoga and meditation from the School of Oriental and African Studies, and is currently undertaking doctoral work in the politics of yoga. She has also created an online teacher training for yoga medicine called Yoga and Politics, Holding the Essence of Yoga. So I can't think of a guest better equipped to navigate the complexities of this conversation than Firdose. So with that said, let's talk about the intersections between yoga and religion with Firdose Moonda. Hi, Firdose. Welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I really appreciate you making time for us again.
Thank you, Rachel. It's really good to be back after some time with some reflection on the stuff we've spoken about before. So I'm excited for this.
Me too, although it's definitely not a topic that on the course that I've just done of yours, which I'm sure we'll talk about through the course of this conversation, something you said was that the history of religion is your favorite thing, which says straight away what different people we are. So I'm very grateful to have you with your enthusiasm here to talk about religion, and I'm sure we'll touch on history as part of that conversation because it's not my area of expertise. And the whole topic kind of kicked off with this really common question that yoga teachers, I'm sure I'm not the only one, get asked all the time, which is yoga a religion? And we always answer, no, yoga's not a religion. It's spirituality, but it's not religion. So, you can mix and match it with whatever religion you have. And I'm pretty sure from just the limited time we've had in conversation so far that your take on that question will definitely not be that simple, that separate, or that straightforward. And so I'm excited to kind of delve into the details and the intersections and maybe the contrasts between yoga and religion today.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely not as straightforward as that.
What a surprise.
I think one of the things I'm very big on is definitions. And it sounds like quite a boring thing to say, actually. But if we really delve very deeply into definitions of words like yoga and words like religion, that starts to unpack some of the answers. Because a lot of the time, the way we define things is based on a set of criteria. And so if define a religion as something which includes a belief system, rituals, elements of practice, commitment. This is not going to sound unfamiliar to people who are yoga practitioners or call themselves yogis or whatever definition they choose to use. So there are definitely things that are similar between yoga and religion, and yoga has been influenced by religions, and it's also influenced other religions. So the answer is much more complicated than yes or no.
Like every single question that has ever been asked on the Yoga Medicine Podcast, the answer is can't tell you in 5 seconds, but that's the point, isn't it? Is diving into the conversation. And I love that you started with definitions, because how can we have a conversation if we don't know really what the terms mean that we're using? So you started, I think, effectively defining there what is a religion, what do we consider a religion? And obviously our personal definition of religion is really deeply influenced by our culture. For me, I'm thinking, well, a religion has to have a deity, right? And there's got to be like a book of some kind, right? And maybe there's a hierarchy of religious authorities like priests and bishops. And so even my definition is influenced by the culture that I've grown up in, even though I'm not religious myself.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, the first thing, and when I said the history of religion is one of my favorite subjects, I think people automatically confuse that with, oh, well, then she must be very religious. And I'm often asked on teacher trainings, am I religious? And my answer, which I suppose could come across as a little bit rude, is usually that's none of your business, because it really isn't anybody else's business. And because I don't think you need to be interested, being interested in religion doesn't mean you are religious. I mean, being a crime reporter doesn't mean you're a criminal, right? So it's about having a particular type of interest. And the reason I'm so interested in religion is because it really is one of the foundation stones of societies. If you look at the way that
Mhm.
civilizations have developed over time, apart from the late industrialist capitalist phase that we're in now, which I suppose you could argue is a religion of its own.
Absolutely.
Religion has always, shaped the way that we operate as societies, shaped our hierarchies, and shaped the way that we interact with other societies. It's really, I mean, today, we're talking and we know that religious war or war over religious differences is occurring in different parts of the world as we speak. And I'm not just talking about the Middle East. I live in Africa, and we have so many wars which are completely overlooked, and nobody really thinks about them. And a lot of them are fought on tribal and religious grounds. And so that is really where my interest stems from. But I want to just, the way you spoke a little bit earlier about defining religion through hierarchy, through the personalities involved. To me, that is really the essential question. And we ask it right at the end of one of our sessions in the Yoga and Politics course, which is, can you say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual? And so I've designed a little test, I suppose, for this, which is to go to somebody who's not me, who's not going to say it's not your business, and ask them if they're religious. And if they say yes, ask them, how do they demonstrate being religious? And what
Mhm.
you will find very often with those people is they will have a very certain answer. They'll tell you either they wear certain clothing, they do certain things on certain days, they believe in this particular structure of things, they read these books, and this is the way that they live their lives. The answer, it can be quite detailed. It's usually quite specific. Of course, it'll be different. You could find somebody who's religious as a Christian who does things one way, and somebody who's religious as a Christian who does things another way. But
Mhm.
generally, they will be able to explain to you what it is that they do, which defines them as religious. Now go do the same test with somebody who says they're spiritual. Ask them,
Yeah.
how do you demonstrate your spirituality? And you're going to get a lot of very, very strange answers. It will be wishy washy generally. It may not have a particular framework. And what you'll find is it'll probably be a mix of certain things from different religions that have been put together in some sort of way that makes it sound like it's a religion, but not. Because really, and this is a firm belief of mine, because I think the idea of being religious, especially in Western society, is such a taboo. It's so old
Mm.
fashioned. People don't want to say that this is what they are. It's really seen as the antithesis to being secular, to being capitalist, to being all the things that we supposedly are today. And you'll find that actually spirituality is just another term for I'm too scared to say I'm religious. And I
Mm.
understand that completely.
Or I
And
believe in
I
something,
also,
but I don't know exactly what
yeah,
that something is. Whereas if you're religious,
yeah.
you know exactly what you believe and what behaviors you're supposed to exhibit to demonstrate that belief.
Yeah, and I
Mm.
think what we also don't maybe leave some space for is that people who are religious change their engagement with religion over time. You don't start off believing the same thing that you end up believing. I mean, I often think of like my dad when I think about religion, because I grew up in a Muslim home, which I would describe as an intersectionally religious home, in that we were also part of the anti apartheid struggle. And I think our belief systems were shaped equally by the religion as they were by the liberation movement. And those things don't always go hand in hand. And I could definitely see the way that religion changed in our household over time. and the way that sometimes the religion influenced what was going on in society. And other times, sorry, I've just had a cat knock over a water bottle. And other times, we've had the religion really standing in the way of what we're trying to achieve as a society, and being able to live with religion. Religion is a living culture, just like yoga, just like anything. So
Mm.
being able to live with the changing of the religion, I think, is really important. And it also destigmatizes it in a way. It makes it a less scary subject to talk about. So the way that I talk about the history of religion, and particularly the intersection of yoga and religion, I like to think about it as being from a little bit of a bird's eye type of outsider view. But then, because I grew up kind of in that mix of Hindu Muslim cosmopolitan type of lifestyle that apartheid forced us into, there's a small bit of an insider viewpoint. And I think sometimes that gives me a perspective that's not as close as to be offended by things that people say, but that's not so far away that I don't understand. So I
Mm.
hope it brings a kind of unique flavor to our discussion.
Mm. And you've already mentioned the history, the wealth of history, and how yoga has changed over time and religions have changed over time. So maybe as we continue to circle around that question of is yoga a religion, we kind of take a step back into the past and look at when yoga developed and what was happening in terms of religion around the same time, because I found this exploration on the course really interesting.
Yes, I think we've got to start with the Vedic period, which we're looking at a time period from around 3,000 before the Common Era until really 500-ish before the Common Era. So it's quite a long period of time. And this is a time in which the religion, I'll just put that in inverted commas, was based on ritual. The idea was that you had to secure good rebirth. So there was perpetual rebirth at this point. There wasn't a cycle of birth and death, birth and death. It was just birth, 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 birth forevermore. And the idea was to engage in ritual to keep a cosmology of gods in order. So, unlike religions of the book, which have one deity, even Christianity, which has a trinity, is based on one divine subject being the subject of the entire trinity. Religions of South Asia, as we're going to call them just for purposes of our discussion, tend to operate with cosmologies, which are multiple gods. Often they take on different avatars over time. They appear and reappear over vast periods of time, and they form part of the creation of the universe and the cycle of life. And so the idea in Vedic religion was to keep a cosmology in order by forming rituals which would please the gods. As we get to around 500 before the Common Era, we see this change. We see a philosophy change where suddenly the cycle of perpetual birth and rebirth can be escaped at the point of death of the physical body if the soul has reached a sufficient level of liberation. And so the idea then is to make sure that the soul has done the work that it needs to do. And I always say to students, do we know that the soul did the work and people were not born or reborn? No, of course we don't, because I wasn't around in 500 before the Common Era, and nobody's come back and reported to us that actually, hey, my soul was liberated and actually I didn't come back. Do we know that perpetual rebirth is a thing? Of course we don't. I don't know
Mm.
whether I had a past life. And so we've got to be able to understand that these are questions we don't have the answers to. We don't have academic scientific tests
Mm.
for birth and rebirth, birth and death, heaven and hell. We don't have any test for that. We're just going on faith.
And I think
And
one really important thing to stress here is that in the modern Western world, we might think of birth and rebirth as a really positive thing. Like life is great. We want to stay in this world, right? We want to come back to this world, right? And get to do all the things we like to do. But in the context of this, that was considered life is hard, life is suffering, and true freedom lies beyond this place and this physical realm. And so you don't want to continue to be reborn. You want to do the work you need to do that you can escape to something presumably better.
yeah, of course. And the other thing is it's a gamble to be reborn because there's absolutely no guarantee that you will be reborn into an equal status or a better
Mm.
status than the one that you currently have. So you're constantly doing something, let's call it the work, in order to try to secure a good rebirth. And then what if you fail? And what if you come back worse off? So the perpetual cycle of birth and rebirth is exhausting. And as you mentioned, the word that was used at the time was it was a cycle of suffering. And so you had to escape that suffering in order to not come back, in order to not be trapped in this persistent cycle. And yeah, I mean, if you really think about it, would you want to be reborn hundreds of thousands of times, not knowing if you're going to come back with a Syrian passport instead of an Australian one or one from New
Yeah.
Zealand? That is a
Me
gamble that
personally,
personally
no,
I don't want to take.
no, I hit the lottery this time around. White, able-bodied, living in New Zealand. Hell no, I'm happy with this one. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that when that philosophy changes and we see that the cycle of rebirth can be broken, or at least let's rather say that the belief system is that the cycle of rebirth can be broken, the rituals change. And so breaking the cycle of rebirth involves things like extreme austerities. So fasting for long periods of time, standing very still, for example, not engaging in action so as not to attract karma to oneself. And this is also the time when we see the emergence of newer religions. So Buddhism and Jainism both crop up at this point in time. And again, it's very important to understand that these two religious movements come out of an existing society. So the Buddha is a middle class Brahmin who comes out of a wealthy household, who engages in all the ideas of Brahmanism, who then sees the ideas of Jainism, tries them out a little bit. There's stories of him fasting down to a grain of rice a day to sort of engage in this extreme austerity measure, decides actually this doesn't really work for me. There's reports of him trying to meditate without breath, so slowing down and stopping the breath, also decides that doesn't work for him. And then he happens upon the idea of meditation, which is called the middle way. And he introduces this into the concept, and he really pioneers meditation as a means of liberating the soul. So, was the Buddha enlightened? Is probably a question to ask at this point in time. I mean, we don't know. We know that he says he was enlightened, and we know that people were willing to believe that. I guess, we could ask a similar question, which might be more resonant to the audience, which is, was Jesus the Son of God? We don't know, but we know that he said he was, and that people believed that he was. And so I think if we just look at it from that perspective, then we can really start to ask the question, well, why did people believe that Buddha was enlightened? And if you look at what was going on at the time, very few people really wanted to engage in the Jain practices, which were very extreme. The ultimate Jain practice, the practice of pure meditation, was willful death. So fasting and stopping the breath until the physical body is no longer. That's not to say we had hundreds of thousands of people essentially ending their lives. It was a small group of people, and your guru had to give you permission to embark on this path. But, it's a pretty extreme thing to do. And Buddha was offering something that was less extreme, but that still allowed you to withdraw from society, that still allowed you to live a monastic life and benefit from a lay population that was keeping you around because they thought that you offered some sort of spiritual presence. So a lot of people thought, all right, that's maybe the way to go. Buddhism, Jainism, and Brahmanism existed, I want to say, fairly peacefully for a period of 1,000 or so years. Brahmanism established the hegemony. So Brahmanism is now the faith that sort of follows on from Vedic culture. It changes in that the cycle of rebirth can be broken, but it really establishes a hegemony through the Bhagavad Gita largely at this point in time. And so Buddhism and Jainism continue to exist in the Indian subcontinent in small numbers. Buddhism is driven out by about the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, and it later returns in a much more modern form. But we start to see there, I mean, there's a good example of one religion making sure that it dominates over the others.
And I mean, even in many of the details of that conversation may have escaped listeners. Definitely, I don't know all of the ins and outs, but even that little chunk of information gave me an appreciation for us not being able to talk about the philosophy of yoga as one simple and straightforward thing. It's big and it's changed a lot over time, just the same way that you can't talk about Christianity as if it's just one simple thing, because there are multiple schools of thought. Even the Old Testament is different to the New Testament. And so even now I'm getting a sense that when we talk about yoga philosophy in really simplistic terms, we're probably lacking at bare minimum some of that appreciation of history.
Yeah, exactly. I think the early philosophy we have to acknowledge does come out of religious culture. And that's primarily
Mm,
also because, remember, at the time, it was the religions that made the law. In fact, that was something that was in place until the Enlightenment period, really, which is, the 15, 1600s, 1700s. So when you've got religion as the defining feature of your society, because that is what is creating the common law, that is what is creating the hierarchies of society. It's not possible to ignore it, and it's not possible to pretend that it wasn't influencing absolutely everything else about the culture.
mm,
Yoga only really divorces itself from religion, if I can use terminology like that, much, much, much later on. And I'm talking as late as the 1800s, really. Because even though you've got hatha yoga, which is something that I suppose a term everybody can relate to, it really generally means the introduction of physical body practice. And hatha yoga starts in around the 11th century and really takes off from the 15th century onwards. Even though you've got that practice forming, and those practitioners are mostly lower caste men who tend not to be quite as religious as the upper caste Brahmins that we've been discussing so far, there's still that sense that there is a coding and a framework within which they want to operate. So, although they're not searching for liberation of the soul, but they're searching for something that I'll just call physical immortality. Again, I don't think it's possible, and I don't know that any one of them has been immortal to date, but they're looking for immortality in longevity of the body, strong muscles, a body that can withstand, a physical body that can withstand, climatic conditions, disease, so on and so on. They're still operating within the coding and the framework that come from religious texts. And so by that, I'm talking about things like the 8 limbs of yoga, things like the yamas and the niyamas. We see yamas and niyamas in different numbers appearing in many hatha texts. So the Hatha Bhyasapadati, which is a text that introduces us to complex yoga poses and to sequencing for the first time, that text contains 25 yamas and niyamas. And you'll know from Patanjali's Yoga Sutras that there are 10 yamas and niyamas.
mm,
Generally, they're sort of the same thing, right? Don't steal, celibacy, be kind. These are things that really parents should be teaching their children and that I don't think adults need to be discussing. But if you look at the 25 that come later on in time, they also include things like being subservient to a guru. So there
mm,
is that creation of hierarchy, and yoga over time, always, the practice has relied on a non-questioning student and an all-knowing guru. That sounds like
mm,
religion, right?
mhm,
I think it's changed now that we've moved into a period of non-lineage yoga. Hopefully, we're getting slightly more critical thought. We're getting people who are willing to interrogate what they're being told. We also have a lot more in terms of scientific intrusion, is maybe the word, into
mm,
yoga, which really would have come at a lot later period in time, and of course heavily influenced now by Western culture. So if we look at those early periods, there is a religious thread that runs through them right up until the end of colonization, I would say. And that's the point where we start to see things develop in a slightly different way. I know that it makes people uncomfortable to hear that, and that they often wonder, it's something you said right at the beginning of our chat, can you sort of exist in your own religion, which may not be a religion of South Asia at all, or it may be a religion of South Asia expressed in a very different way? Can you still do that and engage in yoga? And I guess that's an individual discussion for people to really grapple with when
mm.
they are asked questions like, are you religious? Or, is this a religion you are following?
Yeah, and I mean, as teachers, we just want to say, yeah, absolutely, you can. Come on in, enjoy the class. But like most things, it's probably not that simple and straightforward and requires a little bit more understanding on the teacher's part and self-reflection on the student's part. I mean, even already, I'm sure there's been information that's been new to people that the very ancient roots of yoga are definitely based in things that we would have to call religion. And even when we get to the relatively modern era and those things become more separate, we get to today where yoga is being used, I think nobody would deny, as part of the sort of propaganda of the Hindu nationalist movement in India at the moment. So even now it's difficult to completely divorce yoga from religion?
Now it's harder, I actually think, because particularly in the last 10 years. So I think the last 10 years have actually made it harder to divorce yoga from Hinduism in particular. And
Mm.
then the corollary to that is that it's also made it harder for people of other religions to engage in yoga in a way that they're not getting persecuted. And I'm not meaning necessarily persecution in the streets, although that is also happening in India, but cultural persecution to a degree. So I want to just go back a little bit. And I want to look at the
Please.
history of the Indian subcontinent as we're discussing it today. So we've already spoken a little bit about Brahmanism, Jainism, Buddhism as the three, let's call them the founding religions of yoga. Then we get Tantra, and Tantra is a myriad different practices, most of them initiate based and secret. So it's very difficult to study them from a neutral academic perspective because I wouldn't be an initiate, for example, into a tantric sect. There are certainly some people who go and initiate and participate in the sect and then teach on it, which again crosses that ethical line of should you be sharing the knowledge that is actually meant to be secret. And I mean, that's part of the reason that I've stayed away from it. But tantric sects, which contribute a lot to different yoga ideas, including mantra recitation, including things like mudra, those types of more subtle body practices as well, especially defining energy lines and so on, those practices would usually based on deities in small kind of regional geographic areas. So it could vary from village to village. It could vary from state to state. You could have the huge tantric sects that are, for example, worshippers of Vishnu or Shiva, and tiny, tiny, tiny tantric sects where they're worshipping a little deity that you and I have never heard of, and that's very important in their particular village. So even that religious practice. And then we can move on to Islamic rule, 800 years of Islamic rule, especially in North India, which I think now, especially with the Hindu nationalist upsurge, has been completely overlooked in terms of the contributions, both that they made to yoga, but also the other way, the contribution that yoga made to the development of South Asian Islam. And this is an area that I feel so strongly about because I grew up in a South Asian Muslim home. So my understanding and my engagement with Islam is not the same as Middle Eastern Islam, which, a lot of people will have an idea of Middle Eastern Islam as very conservative. Women are not allowed to leave the home. Women are not allowed to drive. I'm thinking Saudi Arabia here. Iran, wearing the hijab constantly, and this kind of real crackdown on female rights. If you look at South Asian Islam, you've got a much more liberal kind of Islam. You've got a lot of engagement with musical culture, so the devotional music, Qawwali music that comes out of this period in time. I mean, that was something that I grew up with, for example. There's definitely a lot more in terms of the visibility of women, and their culture's a lot more based in the meditative practices, and it's almost like a deep love of God. So the Sufi practices particularly are based and rooted in extreme devotion, which is very similar to the Bhakti movement. And those two things had a lot of crossover. And so we have this 800-year period of Islamic rule in India, which ends with British colonization. And that contribution also involves documentation, because when the Muslims arrived, they arrived with the ability to write things down, to translate texts. So a lot of the documentation, a lot of the illustration of the earliest yoga poses would have come from those eyes, which also means they were seeing what they wanted to see, right? So if you're a devotee of Islam and you are seeing what looks like a Hindu practice to you, you may document it in a way that almost turns it slightly away from a Hindu practice and a little bit more into what you want to see. And we see many, many, many examples of that. That's all kind of being buried, under-researched, tucked away. And instead, what we're hearing from the Modi government is yoga is Hindu. He's drawing this very straight line. Everything is linear. Vedism links straight into yoga development, links straight into modern Hinduism. It's too simplistic to be true. And it's really coming at the expense and at the exclusion of a lot of Muslim practitioners of yoga, Christian practitioners of yoga in India, minority groups, LGBTQI plus people, any kind of different identification to this very violent Hindu nationalism is being put aside. And to me, that's something we have to push back against. And I just want to say, as a disclaimer, I travel to India fairly regularly for work. Last year, I was there for a period of time. It was the first time that I struggled to get a visa. And I struggled to get a visa because of my name, which is a Muslim name. And I have said, even on the course, I don't really know what the consequences of saying something like this is. We know that there is a crackdown on the media. We know that there are crackdowns on freedoms of speech and expression in India, and that extends to what's happening to yoga. So yoga is highly, highly politically religious in this
Mm.
conversation that we're having.
Yeah, which is certainly not what I want to hear as a Western yoga teacher. I like the simplicity of no, it's not a religion. Come one, come all, be welcome. But just because I don't want that to be true doesn't make it true. So I think conversations like these are really important to have for those of us who are teaching yoga to be a little bit more educated in terms of looking back in history, but also looking around us right now.
Yep, exactly. And I guess, it sounds like sort of quite highfalutin theory that we're discussing. But I guess what we need to ask ourselves is, what can we do to push back against an essentialism of yoga, against a takeover of yoga by one religious movement, by one religious leader, by one political leader, all of those types of things. And some of the answers are actually really practical and easy to do. So, for example,
Right.
Narendra Modi is the reason we have International Day of Yoga. He is the person who petitioned for it when he became prime minister. He did so at the UN. They gave him the day. And it is an amazing way for him to use soft power to present India as the seat of spirituality in the world, to sort of orange wash or saffron wash the things that he is doing in terms of Hindu nationalism and fascism. And people participate in this day because it's fun. In the Northern Hemisphere, they participate in it because it's on the day of the summer solstice. It's the longest day of the year. It's wonderful. Us in the Southern Hemisphere, I must be honest with you, I've always thought like, oh, this is a horrible day. It's my worst day. Winter solstice, the shortest day, freezing cold, dark, just awful.
Hey, I've done
And
108 sun salutations on the International Day of Yoga before, so I'm
many
not
have.
innocent over here. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Many have. And so I guess we have two choices. One is, do we not participate in the day at all and instead use the opportunity as an education piece and a way to say to people that this day was created for a very specific purpose by a politically inclined leader who is using yoga as part of his strategy to do X, Y, and Z? That's one option. The other option is to participate from the inside and then to try and change it that way. So go into the day, go armed with all the knowledge that you need to have about why the day exists, who benefits from it, what does it mean to link yoga so closely with Hinduism only, and then to go and say to people, should we still be participating in this day? Can we participate in it in a way that is more of a protest than a reverence? Of course, that requires willpower. It
Mm.
also means, and you've mentioned this, that the kind of calm, nice, Zen-like yoga that we want to involve ourselves in will have to be paused because we want to take action. We want to speak out against something. All of these things are energy consuming and
Mm-hmm.
draining. And I'll tell you that from having done a lot of it myself.
I'll
And
bet.
it means that we've got to approach yoga in exactly the same way as we approach all the other complicated, complex, nuanced things in our lives. When you go and vote in your country's election, hopefully, you don't just randomly go and make a cross next to the person with the nicest photograph or the best color flag, right? You've thought about it, you're making an
Mm-hmm.
informed decision, and you know that it influences the way you will live in your country for the next 4 or 5 years, whatever the case might be. I think we need to do the same with our yoga. There is a place, certainly, for, let me just call it the exercising, where hopefully we can find some calm, peace, quiet, challenge to an extent as well,
Mm.
physical conditioning, and whatever else terminology you want to put on it. Because moving the body, and remember, the only way we can move the body is not by doing yoga asana. There are lots of other things we can do. But
Sure.
that has its place. But then when we take the culture of it, yoga also offers us this amazing opportunity to interrogate, to introspect, to explore, to push back, to be better, right? That's the philosophy, be better in the world, put out something that is more positive. And
Mm.
the world we're living in now is, led by strong men. I don't have to tell you how many elections we're having this year and who we expect to win some of those elections, which is really scary.
Mm.
And we all can play a role in, the best way we can change things. And I speak as, a child of democratic South Africa, where we changed it. We went and we all voted. We were able to finally vote, and, things changed. And now we're 30 years into democracy. We don't have to be a politician. Your existence, as we've already said on this podcast, is political. So you've got an opportunity to use your voice and to take a stand. And I think that it is a responsibility on yoga teachers to educate themselves around this.
Well, here's a counterpoint for you, because you've already mentioned how much work that involves. And I can certainly imagine teachers thinking as they hear that, well, do you know what the safest thing to do is? The safest thing is to treat religion and yoga's history the same way that I treat politics. I don't talk about politics in my classes. I don't discuss who I'm voting for or that there are elections coming up. So I just won't talk about religion and I won't talk about yoga's history. And maybe I won't even mention philosophy. Are we still teaching yoga then if we are taking out so many of those historic and cultural elements? Can we still say that we're teaching yoga then?
Mm-mm.
Or is that just kind of
Yeah, it's a really
bypassing
good
the issue?
question. And it sort of stumps me a lot, and I don't always have the same answer to it. I mean, the first thing I want to say is that I always talk about politics in my yoga classes. I always talk about the elections. I think elections are just something that we must never take for granted. As somebody whose parents and grandparents couldn't vote until 30 years ago, I think it's something we really must talk about. But I do understand, as you mentioned, people are uncomfortable discussing politics, and so they want to shelve it away. Look, I'll give you two kind of viewpoints on, are you still teaching yoga if you don't teach history or philosophy? The one is that in the kind of late colonial period, so the early 1900s, we had a selection of yoga teachers from India, male yoga teachers from India, who were teaching the physical practice at the exclusion of pretty much everything else. And I'm talking about guys like Sri Yogendra or Kuvalayananda, who sets up the Kaivalya Dharma Institute, who wanted to view yoga asana as a means to become healthy, who wanted to explore the scientific benefits of yoga asana, who wanted to help people cure disease or prevent disease, depending on which way you look at it, and who were very clear in the texts that they wrote. So Sri Yogendra wrote a book called Yoga Asana Simplified, that this is for everyone. This is not just for Hindus. In fact, he said there's a misconception that yoga is for people who are only of the Hindu mind. This is not about that. And this is not about any kind of philosophy. We are just teaching a physical practice. That is what a lot of yoga teachers do today, right? The difference, of course, is that they're not Indian men, a lot of them. A lot of them would be Western women. So I suppose there is an argument you can make that Indian yoga teachers did it. They said it was okay. Therefore, we can also do it and it's okay. The other part of the argument would be that the history of yoga, I did a master's degree in it, which took a year. I've been working on a doctorate, which I don't think will be finished anytime soon because I also have a full-time job. So the history of yoga is taking years and years and years and years to look at and get one person's head around. And you're not going to teach it in a 60-minute yoga class, right? There is absolutely no way. So the question you have to ask yourself is, if I'm going to drop a little nugget, is it going to be the most concise, succinct, well thought out nugget I can drop that's not going to lead to students saying to me, hang on, what about this? What about that? What about that? Or should I leave it out entirely and not risk going there? And I think that's for individual teachers to decide. I think those with more experience and those who've maybe engaged in the material at different levels could maybe find a sentence or two, could find a little thing to drop in that may just, spark something in someone's head, get someone thinking about the history of yoga in a different way. And you don't even have to get them thinking about the history of yoga. Maybe what you want to get them thinking about is the situation outside the door of that studio. So, what
Mm.
in yoga philosophy will turn, or maybe not turn, will just ignite something in the student that when they leave this door, and there is, I don't know what the situation is outside your studio door, but outside the studio we are in, for example, in Cape Town, you will literally walk out the door and there will be 10 people begging for food, asking for money, and maybe someone's going to pull a knife or a gun out if they decide that today is not the day and they want something from you. In that moment, how can a yoga teacher react that will get the practitioner to make a decision that is humane, maybe that is charitable, that is kind?
Mm.
And by charitable, I don't necessarily mean financially charitable. There are many ways that one can be charitable. Or
Mm.
does a less experienced yoga teacher who's maybe concentrating on today, we're going to get into, I don't know, the splits. Is it necessary when you're trying to get into the splits to now be interrogating the socio-political situation outside the door? And I think maybe that's the questions we should be asking ourselves. So a lot of it will depend on the kind of teacher you are. We've had people
Mm.
attending our yoga and politics course who've actually left the course saying, now that I know all the stuff, actually what I know is I'm not going to talk about it,
Mm.
which I think I'm sort of okay with, right? I'd be interested to hear your view, but I almost think that maybe that's okay. Maybe now you know it, and you know that this is an area of such discomfort for you that you're not able to present it in an articulate, authentic way that holds integrity, and then you stay away from that. I think what we really require is honesty. We need teachers to
Mm.
say, I am a teacher that is only interested in teaching yoga asana. I will get you into the splits, headstand, handstand, and you're going to have an amazing summer body. That's all I can do for you. I can't teach you morality, how to be a better person, the history of India. If there's that level of honesty, I think that's better than pretending.
Mm. And I love the fact that you used the phrase "an awesome summer body" for the first time on the Yoga Medicine podcast, I'm pretty sure. Look, I love that answer. Tiffany and I just recorded an episode, I don't know, maybe a week ago on answering student questions. And
Mhm.
we always talk about in teacher trainings how important it is to be able to say, I don't know. But I do
Yeah.
think there are some questions that students ask you to which, as a teacher, your answer shouldn't be, I don't know. And those questions to me are things around, why do you teach the way you teach? Why do you make the
Mhm.
decisions that you
Yeah.
do? Why do you say namaste or not say namaste?
Yeah.
Why do you mention history or religion or not
Yeah.
mention history or
Yeah.
religion? And I do think the answer shouldn't be, oh, I don't know. The answer should be that you've done some thinking, that you've done a bit
Yeah.
of study, you've done a bit of research, you've realized it's a
For sure.
topic that is so messy and so uncomfortable for you that it's something that you don't want to open that box, or that you want to invite curiosity instead of providing answers. So I love the
Yeah.
fact that you have turned it back on the teacher to do some thought and reflection and decide, what kind of teacher do I want to be? Do I want to be upfront and say, I teach asana? Or do
Which
you
is
want to
okay,
say that,
right? That's not the end of the world. That's
yeah,
an okay thing
agreed,
to do. And
people
I
benefit?
also think, I've got a lot of um I want to call them like former yoga teachers, or maybe it's like lapsed yoga teachers. I'm not sure what the word is. But I think particularly when the cultural appropriation conversation happened, what I saw, especially on the ground here in South Africa, and you might have a different reflection depending on where you're listening to this from, is that, and here we're, especially Cape Town, a place that loves to follow a global trend. So what's happened now is a lot of people who were teaching yoga have now started teaching all sorts of different kinds of Pilates, functional Pilates, whatever, reformer Pilates. I'm not a Pilates expert, but I just say what I see on Instagram. A lot of it looks a lot like yoga, but I think the idea is that they no longer have to engage in the cultural conversation, the social
Mhm.
conversation, the political conversation. They can just teach the stuff. And there's a lot of counting, I've noticed. Like everybody does things 5, 4, 3. It's very weird. But that is also fine.
Yeah.
And I think we have to recognize that there is a place, especially with sedentary lifestyles. we have to exercise, we have to move. People are not gardening for 4 hours on a Saturday morning anymore. I mean,
Mm.
not in the cities that I have lived in. And
People
people
here
are
definitely
not.
still garden for 4 hours on a Saturday, but then they come to yoga on the Monday and their back is really sore and they need some care. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
you
I agree.
see.
There's definitely a place for caring for the physical body. No two ways about it. This podcast, we've got plenty of episodes on the physical benefits of yoga. There's no doubt about that. But that's not all
And
there
so
is,
maybe
obviously.
that's not all there is. And I think the
Mm.
question that's facing a lot of teachers now is, where do I fit in
Hmm.
when I'm trying to place myself on the spectrum between politically conscious? I mean, I almost want to use a terminology like woke, which I don't
Hmm.
necessarily think is a bad thing, yoga teacher versus I'm actually above all of this spirituality. And one of the things that I suppose, recently come across in my teaching, especially to students on 200-hour teacher trainings, who I would call newish to yoga culture and newish to this level of thought, is I think a helpful way to think about it is just to do a little bit of reflexivity. So it's very simple. It's a question of just naming yourself, who you are, what you are, and how you fit into yoga culture. So I gave an example, I won't make this
Mm.
too long, but like, me, for example, I'm a third generation Indian South African who now lives a middle class lifestyle, lives in a white area, does kind of the things that my parents and grandparents would never have been able to do and would never have even dreamt that they'd be able to do. So, I mean, I bring with myself the element of disadvantage, and now I have to recognize in myself the element of extreme privilege. And I come to yoga for many, many reasons. One of them is to understand my own culture better, because I don't have a lot of family lineage I can trace. And I've always wanted to know, where do I come from? When did my parents or grandparents decide to come to South Africa? I don't even know that, for example. And what was life like when they were in India? And how did they get to India? Are they indigenous Indians, or did they come some other way? So in trying to understand my own history better, I've tried to look at it through a yoga lens, and I've tried to interrogate as much of that history as I can. And I bring that with me into the room. At the same time, the reason I first started doing yoga asana 15 years ago was pain through running. Hamstring pain, quad pain, hip pain, a calf
Hmm.
tear, a shoulder injury. All these very like modern things which needed to get better, which I had to sort out, and I wasn't sorting them out. So that this was the way that I sorted them out. And if I can put those two things together, what does that make me? It makes that what it makes me is that that's the whole person that's coming into the room. And if you're willing to then share from that place, so I can easily tell you about years and years of rehabbing a rotator cuff tear, and the ongoing sort of boring trauma of it every single time. And you may be very interested in that, because that might be something you're experiencing in the physical body. And to be honest with you, it was quite interesting, uh, even though it was tough. Or I can also tell you about, the history of yoga in the 17th century in India. Some
Mm.
person might be interested in both those things, and some people may be interested in one or the other. You're going to take what you're going to take from me. That's the same for any teacher in any situation.
Hmm.
There are so many times that a teacher will say one sentence that will stay with a student for years. And there are also probably more times, and especially with someone like me who talks a lot, where a teacher will say something and the students will just be like, what on earth is she on about? Like, this is ridiculous. She's talking mumbo jumbo. And I think all of that is okay if you're doing it from a very, very honest place. I liked
Mm.
your thing about, you can say, I don't know. You can't say, I don't know why I choose to do a certain thing, but you can
Mm.
say, I don't know, if you don't know.
Yeah,
Is the history
absolutely.
of physical yoga 2000 years old? Your answer genuinely can be, I don't know,
I don't
but
know.
I can go
Yeah.
and look it up. I can do some research around it, and I can come back to you. And I think
Hmm.
people are a little bit scared to do that. So I hear them making up all sorts of things about pose name. No, don't make stuff up, because
Mm.
that contributes to this mysticism of yoga, which really depoliticizes it, which de-religiousizes it. And that's appropriation. That's harmful appropriation. So don't do that. Rather, don't know and find out, or don't
Mm.
find out if you don't want to find out. Leave it. Just say, I don't know, I'm not interested. Fine. And carry on with your life. And I think if we really apply ourselves in those ways, we can change the culture of yoga. Rachel, something I gain a lot from talking to you whenever we speak, which is not that often, but is that we are also making the history of yoga,
Mm-hmm.
because this conversation is probably a conversation people haven't heard before. I mean, it's a conversation I've had, but certainly not in this format before. Your views and my views are new to each other. So we're also creating the history of yoga. And every time we do something in the yoga world, we're adding to and contributing to that history. And in 500 years' time, people will look back and say, oh, did you know in 2024 they started talking about yoga and Hindu nationalism? And that really means that we have a big responsibility to contribute in a way that is effective.
I love that as a sort of beginning of wrapping up in terms of where we leave people, because as is very common with a yoga medicine podcast, we've provided no easy answers, because usually there aren't any really easy answers. And if we circle back to, is yoga a religion? The answer is probably yes, no, maybe, depends.
Yeah,
There's a lot more
absolutely.
detail to it than that. And in terms of the implications for people listening to this, it really is personal, isn't it? What kind of teacher do you want to be? Be intentional about that. And if you do want to be part of changing the history of yoga, or shaping the history of what yoga becomes in the future, then there's probably some work to be done, some research and reading to be done, some self-reflection to be done.
Yeah, and also be open to changing the kind of teacher you are, because I think the teacher you start off as is not the teacher you develop into, is not the teacher
Mm.
that you end up as. And also, your life happens to you along the way. You start in a particular place, and then life changes, your jobs change, your financial situation changes, your family situation changes. All of those things leave an imprint, and all of those things influence the type of person that one becomes. And so certainly, I mean, the teacher I am even May of 2024 to the teacher I was in December of 2023 is different, because my experiences have changed. The groups of people that I've taught have changed.
Mm.
The world has changed. So I think that that's okay, to be constantly trying to use what you know to inform your next step. And to realize that, like, changing is good. Changing your mind is good. It's a sign of thinking, and it doesn't always have to be progress necessarily, but it is movement backwards, forwards, sideways.
And this actually brings us full circle back to where we started, when you were saying that people's relationship to their faith or their religion isn't usually a static, fixed thing right through the course of their life. Their relationship with their religion usually changes as they change, and their experiences and their understandings change. And so you've brought that right back to yoga. Our practice changes, our understanding of what we're doing in our practice, and therefore how we teach it to people, it's inevitable that it will change as we change. So
Yeah,
maybe
absolutely.
we can be mindful about which changes occur and how.
I love that idea. I think that's a great idea. I just want to add one thing about a potential future offering on yoga medicine, which will come later this year, which I think will
Mm.
also fuel this conversation, which is a course I'm running or looking to run in September, which is really a decolonizing yoga course that aims to look at yoga through different artistic lenses. So we're going to look at intersections of yoga and poetry, yoga and music, yoga and painting, and really go through the periods in time when documentation of yoga was happening, as I mentioned a bit earlier, and look at who was doing the documenting. And what I love so much about the way that you approach this is, as you say, these are things created by people. This
Yeah.
didn't like evaporate down from the sky. People created it. People documented yoga poses. People shaped the way that yoga has interacted with different disciplines. And what I found is that the more you look into that, and the closer and closer you get to understanding yoga's place in society, the more you're actually engaging in the work of decolonization. Decolonization is a big theme for me in my life as a person. I always say twice colonized, colonized in my grandparents were colonized in India, and we were colonized here in apartheid South Africa. And decolonization really, I feel so strongly to say, is not pre-colonization. We are not trying to go back to societies that had many problems of their own, including misogyny, patriarchy, lack of structure, all of those things. Decolonization is actually about creating something new. It's actually about reimagining and coming up with something that is so different and so inclusive and so imaginative that it requires both the work of going back and the work of going forward. And so I'm really trying to look at yoga through that lens. And in that, it's going to pass through the prisms of religion. Because as we said, religion shaped all these societies pre-colonization. And so it's going to pass through those prisms. And we're going to touch on the way that yoga moves through the religions, moves through the artistic cultures, moves through the people, and then see what comes out the other side. So I'm really excited for that. I hope you're going to be there, Rachel. I hope others are going to be there as well, because I think it's going to start to help us answer the question that you asked on this podcast about, is yoga religious? And also, are we religious when we engage in yoga? I think it's going to help us get a little closer to an answer.
I love that. And I think that's a great sort of forward-looking step for people who are intrigued and or confused and or troubled or made uncomfortable by this conversation. Anything that's creating some little internal shift or vibration is probably a good sign that you should investigate further. So that course is an option, and obviously we will link to you and your website and your Instagram page for people who want to know more. Is there anywhere else that you'd send people who want to dive a little deeper into this family of topics?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think the Race and Yoga Journal, which is a journal published by the University of Berkeley, which I will maybe send you the website link
Great.
that you can add to the show notes. I think that's a good starting point because it looks at yoga through the lens of critical race thinking to a degree, but also through personal stories and engagement of especially South Asian practitioners of yoga. I think instead of directing people to more resources, the one thing I would like to maybe add is a caution in that I think, especially Instagram, we're seeing a lot of very knee jerk type of definitions of what yoga is or isn't, who does or doesn't own yoga, who is entitled to certain aspects of the yoga discussion. And I often find that the very loud voices are the ones we must be the most careful of because they tend to distill information in a way that lacks nuance. And so I think, lots of people, especially these days, we have to be honest, will use social media as an information tool and will get inspiration from the things that they see there. And I think that that's great. But I urge people to look at those things with a little bit of caution and to really ask themselves whether what they are seeing is really kind of going to add to their knowledge or confuse them a little bit more. And then to go and look at some more personal type practices. The other thing which I've really started to get interested in is the yoga culture of the early 1900s. So it's very easy to download, and usually for free, the books of people like Sri Yogendra. In fact, we're doing a Sri Yogendra book club on yoga medicine at the end of the month, so people can join that as well. To download especially the work of Kuvalayananda, which is the Mamamsa Yoga Journal on the Kaivalya Dharma website. It has changed. The institute is 100 years old this year, and the last maybe 10 years have been affected by happenings in India, including Hindu nationalism. But I think if you go through earlier editions of the journal, there's some really interesting things to find there around early scientific studies into the efficacy of yoga, as well as understanding bits of yoga culture. So from an academic resource perspective, I think Race and Yoga Journal and the Mamamsa Yoga Journal. And from a social cultural perspective, I think look on Instagram, look on TikTok. I don't know what else people use these days. And then just really critique what it is that you're seeing, because your own critique is going to be more valuable than someone else's shouting.
Yeah, what a surprise that we mentioned social media, because I think those of us who are kind of looking for uh, a quick alleviation of that discomfort or confusion can sometimes be seduced by the real simple messages of those loud voices on social media. And so if you're finding a really quick, easy answer to your question, chances are you are looking at the wrong person.
Yes.
Because usually the
Great
answers aren't quick or
advice.
easy, are they? Usually they require more work, reflection. Sad but true.
And yeah, I don't think social media is always the place to discuss highly complex issues unless one can make a series of reels or a very long thread or, I don't know, stuff that I haven't really engaged in yet.
Mm. No, I love that. I think that's a great finishing place, that we're sort of in that prism between past and future. And even in conversations like this, that we've focused quite a bit of our time looking back in history. I think that's a really potent reminder that, hey, history is still happening now. And 500 years from now or 1,000 years from now, maybe what would we like the conversation to be? We can shape that. We can be part of future history. So I think that's a really positive finishing point. I will link to the resources that you've mentioned, as well as our previous podcast episode. I appreciate your time, your enthusiasm. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Sure, thanks, Rachel. It sounds very interesting, the resources that you're going to link. I'm sure people will have a great time, and I look forward to chatting to you again.
Thanks, Firdose. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.